Hey guys, Ron here, and you know something's very popular when it's been parodied countless amount of times. As the biggest media franchise of all time, Pokemon is right out there in the open, ready to be picked apart. But the problem is, especially during Pokemania around 25 years ago, when a bulk of these parodies came out, adults did not know what a Pokemon was. Some made the effort, but even as the years went by and Pokemon proved that it wasn't just a fad, the same old jokes were still reused in various Pokemon parodies, and I'm gonna rate them. Of course, when a Pokemon fan makes a parody, it's gonna make sense, and will be made for Pokemon fans. But that's not what I'm going to be ranking today, especially since there are thousands of them online. Instead, I want to show you guys Pokemon parodies that appeared on good old television. Parodies made by and for people who don't consume Pokemon. I'm not talking about the hundreds of references and Easter eggs hidden throughout various shows, or even the odd joke or sentence where Pokemon is mentioned. I'm rating entire episodes or multiple scenes that are dedicated to Pokemon. I'm not critiquing acting or production value all that much, but mostly how accurate they were to Pokemon's general idea, how outdated or out of touch the jokes are, and of course, if it's entertaining to a Pokemon fan. There are more than just the batch I'm critiquing today, so if you want to see a sequel, leave a like and we'll see if I can stomach another part of this. We're not going in any chronological order, so let's begin with the relatively recent Pokemon parody, among the group I chose at least. Considering the fact that The Simpsons has existed since, I don't know, the Hindenburg disaster, it has been running during the entire lifetime of the Pokemon franchise. So there's been many references, small jokes, and Easter eggs relating to Pokemon, but weirdly enough, the first time an entire plot of an episode was a Pokemon parody was almost a year after Pokemon Go came out. So it was even kinda late to the whole Pokemon Go craze. Although that's kinda not fair to say, since basically a week after the game came out, they did swiftly release a short where Homer takes Bart and Lisa to the zoo and is too distracted catching Pokemon in the game to notice the baby giraffe taking its first step, and Bart getting too close to the lions. It's crazy hearing Homer Simpson himself listing real Pokemon names like Sandshrew and Drowsy, but it's barely a parody, yet honestly kind of funny, and I also like how it's mostly making fun of Homer being irresponsible instead of hating on the game. I can't say that much for the Pokemon Go related episode that they made. In looking for Mr. Good Bart, Bart becomes a gigolo, but in the B-plot, Homer discovers Pokémon Go, which is odd because according to the previous short we just mentioned, Pokemon does exist. Regardless, it does not waste time disparaging the game and its players from the literal first line. As soon as Homer hears about it, he exclaims that it's gotta be the stupidest game he's ever heard of. And later in the episode, Marge states that it's a waste of time. Now, I'm fine with out-of-touch parents thinking a game for kids is dumb, but I never understood when they go to the extreme and say that it's the worst and has no value. It's a game. It's just a way people pass time. Nobody says watching baseball is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of, and in that case, you're not even playing the game, you're just watching it. But I'm not gonna keep the salty energy throughout the entire video, because we're gonna be here for a long time. So I won't take it personally, we're just rating the parody, so as long as it's funny and somehow accurate, I'm gonna be happy. Okay, I'm not happy. Unfortunately, the jokes are just low-hanging fruit. Nothing clever, but you kinda expected that since this is a modern Simpsons episode. That means the writers are old and out of touch, I think. Since 2016, I personally always found it dumb that people thought that in order to play Pokemon Go, you have to walk while looking at your phone, or that you have to go to an exact spot in order to catch a Pokemon, when you literally do not. Not to mention that even though this episode came out 20 years after Pokemon did, the writers still do not understand the way Pokemon are named. They just use gibberish and make the lowest effort Fakemon designs. Again, this is a nitpick, but some of the other episodes and parodies that we have in this video actually did put in the effort. At the end of the day, I like how they straight up say that the game itself is fine and actually helps Homer lose weight, and that reality is dangerous and not the game. But even though at the time this episode came out, anime was becoming way more mainstream and people understood modern Japanese media, they threw in various outdated anime references like Princess Mononoke and I guess Ultraman. It's as if the writers missed 30 years of Japanese media, despite it becoming more and more influential within, Western animation circles. At least in 2017, I believe so. But I guess the animators aren't the ones writing the jokes. I liked how the A and B plot converged, with Homer and his Pokémon searchers helping to look for the old lady that Bart's lost in the forest. The parody of the Pokemon theme song that Lisa sings is also not bad. 6 out of 10. Is Robot Chicken obscure? I mean, it's been going on for nearly 20 years on Adult Swim, so I figure most of you guys at least heard of it. Its episodes basically consist of many short parodies of all sorts of things, using stop-motion animated action figures. So with literally thousands of shorts in this series, you bet at least 5 of them parody the highest-grossing media franchise of all time. So while it doesn't have an entire episode dedicated to a Pokemon parody, it does have an episode's worth of Pokemon parodies over the span of its lifetime. The first that I could find in my lazy amount of research is the one where Pikachu and Bulbasaur are just saying their names, and then Squirtle gets fed up and says that this whole thing makes no sense. As if that's what the show is. I mean, Pokemon saying their name is just a replacement for them making an animal noise, so this is like writers complaining that the dog was barking. Again, maybe I'm just desensitized to it. It could very much be that this is just weird. But regardless, the joke isn't funny. In the next short, we get to see what's inside a Pokeball. Turns out, it's a club, and Pikachu gets mad that Ash is choosing him to battle in the middle of a hangover. Charizard makes this sound, and the short ends. I guess since we're rating these, it does lose a point for missing the fact that Ash's Pikachu doesn't go in his ball. The next one is actually the most accurate, with some hiccups, because Ash and his friends actually come across the Pokemon daycare, and naturally inquire about Pokemon breeding. I like how this is a reference that only actual Pokemon players would know. They even get the Hoenn daycare man's design correct, and at no point does it belittle fans or the franchise. But towards the end, they kind of force Pikachu to breed with a Charizard, and I was going to bring up the fact that those two aren't in the same egg group. But then Misty says, wait, I thought the Pokemon had to be the same species to make an egg. They were so close! If they would have gotten the egg group fact correctly, I would have given the point back. The final one is the weirdest, because Ash is clearly battling Price, who says, welcome to the Johto Gym, Ash! Which is incorrect, since that's kind of like going into a random McDonald's in the middle of Ohio, and the cashier saying, welcome to the American McDonald's. I mean, he'd be right, but it would still be weird. Ash chooses Pikachu because that's the only Pokemon Ash has in any Pokemon parody, but Price chooses the late and not so great Henry Kissinger to fight. Who the hell wrote this? It's the dumbest idea, but I do like when Price orders Henry to use War Crime Attack. That's my favorite move in the games. Overall, Robot Chicken is hit or miss, but as a Pokemon fan, these are slightly more enjoyable to watch. I give it a 7 out of 10, and that's generous. Bob's Burgers was a show I expected to be pretty subtle and witty about their parody. Considering it's relatively newer than a lot of the other shows on this list, I wasn't worried. This episode revolves around Borobu cards. It's basically like Pokemon, but just everybody's a slug. No, seriously, that's literally what Tina says in the episode.
So Borobu's like Pokemon, but just everybody's a slug?
Yeah. Finally!
Therefore, it's not really a stand-in for Pokemon, so my feeble and sensitive Pokemon heart won't be broken when they make fun of my favorite franchise that I blindly consume. I like how they acknowledge a system akin to EX cards, and how casual collectors don't know the rules that these card games have. I also really like their Pokemon theme song parody, and you know me. If you give me good music, I will falsify votes for you. So, Bob's Burgers gets a 7.5 out of 10. It's also pretty cool how Borobu comes back in the series, which is similar to our next entry. Of all cartoons, Johnny Test has 2 entire Pokemon parody episodes. Tinymon is their iteration. Right off the bat, it does do the classic trope of parodying anime characters by having them sound like they're part of an English dub from the 60s, where the characters talk unnaturally fast with a slight accent and intonation. This comes from the fact that at the time, the only anime that the writers probably consumed would have been that of old dubs of shows like, Speed Racer. It's my least favorite trope in these Pokemon parodies, that and the parents seemingly not understanding why kids play Pokemon. Again, I understand an adult not enjoying Pokemon, but why do they act as if they can't even possibly fathom why kids enjoy a game? Apart from that, this is one of the better parodies for many reasons. Johnny Test is also one of the only shows to actually showcase the fact that Pokemon is a multimedia franchise. Once Johnny is told to stop watching the show and go outside, he goes and plays the handheld video game of Tinymon. They have a very cool Lugia parody called Screecherine that is basically their Mew, because everybody's searching for it. But it's cool how they aren't just parodying Generation 1. And the Tinymon that Blast Ketchup uses is actually pretty sick. Kadoomerang is like this crab with boomerang claws that it throws. That's probably the best Fakemon we're gonna see in any of these Pokemon parodies. Now, Johnny's sisters, who use him like a lab rat, and whom I had a major crush on as a kid, send him into the game, but in order to come out, he has to defeat Blast Ketchup, but unfortunately the only Pokemon Johnny manages to catch is the laughing stock of old Tinymon, Cuddlebuns. The entire audience laughs at Johnny when he sends out Cuddlebuns, but I was actually impressed with the twist that Cuddlebuns evolves into the legendary Screecherine. I watched this episode as a kid, yet when I rewatched it today, I actually did not see the twist coming. In Return of Johnnymon later in the same season, Blast Ketchup returns to take revenge for his loss to Johnny and Screecherine. I very much love how they take advantage of the fact that this was a sequel to a previous episode by parodying the fact that Pokemon introduces new generations by having Johnny get the latest Tinymon game, which has a whole new roster of Tinymon, including a few new evolutions to Tinymon in the previous episode. And the fact that the new game also has double battles now makes it feel like they actually researched or even played the games. It does lose a point for the outdated anime references and tired tropes of parents excessively hating Pokemon, so 8 out of 10 feels appropriate. The next parody, which came out years before Johnny Test's episode, dials these annoying tropes up to 11. South Park's the big one, with Chim Pokemon. I'm not gonna explain what that means, but it once again does the most exaggerated version of the old outdated 60s Speed Racer English dub voice. You know, 30 years after these kinds of dubs existed. And throughout the episode, the whole trope where adults don't understand why kids enjoy a game is driven to death. Driven to death or driven to the ground? Or driven to death to the ground? What is the saying? Driven to death. No, it's not driven to death. Is beat to death? Oh, beat to death. It's beat to death. The only difference that makes this more bearable, despite it having the most exaggerated examples of these tropes, is that it's kind of funny. It touches upon kids consuming these pieces of media in order to fit in, but slowly the episode stops being a parody of Pokemon and more of a made-up scenario where Japan tries to take over America by brainwashing the kids into fighting for Japanese supremacy. You mean these guys? They're harmless. You see, at the time, Japanese culture wasn't seen as innocuous and beloved as it is today. I'm talking about in the West, obviously. The only things Americans knew about Japan was that they were our enemies in World War II and that they were our economic rivals during the 80s. So in the 90s, they saw Japan similarly to how Americans see China nowadays. I don't know, as a threat to the economy or something? Instead of a land with the same things that we have, but better. Back then, Pokemon's rise was seen as more sinister than previous fads because it came from our biggest rival. That's why parents didn't bat an eye when kids went crazy for things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, He-Man, or G.I. Joe, despite these franchises being made to sell toys and were as much of a predatory marketing scheme as they claim Pokemon to be. Before this episode goes on a xenophobic tangent, we see the South Park parents trying their best to watch an episode of Shin Pokemon and not even remotely understanding what they just watched. I guess if a person from the West were to consume Western fantasy for the first time with wizards and orcs, or space operas with the Force, which is basically also wizards and orcs, they too would be as lost and confused about what the hell they were watching. Yet at that time, anything Eastern was seen as too exotic to understand. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. Would have been less, but the episode is funny and entertaining. It's a classic South Park episode. But if adults were out of touch during the inception of Pokemania in the late 90s, does a newer show manage to avoid these unsavory tropes a quarter of a century later? Why did I say a quarter of a century? Am I that old? Big City Greens actually boasts more Pokemon fans in its animation staff than I've ever seen in any cartoon, so I have high hopes. In Big City Greens, Galaxoo exists. Galaxoos themselves are actually well designed and for the first time have names that actual Pokemon would have, like Orbiturtle and Nebulam. Nebulam even has a cool move called Lambush. Watch out, it's a Lambush! But the most important aspect is the fact that at no point during the episode is Galaxoo made fun of or disparaged. The Galaxoo show itself still looks like an amalgamation of general anime tropes with over-the-top dialogue, but at least they use the word anime in Big City Greens. That makes a difference, to me at least. Probably not to you. The grandma obviously doesn't understand the show, but not because it makes no sense to her, but rather because, unlike in her day, nobody in the cartoon is getting hit in the head with an anvil. At the end of the episode, the lesson learned wasn't that Galaxoo is a waste of time or a fad, cause a 25-year-old fad isn't a fad. No, Cricket and Remy learned the actual value of friendship. Or I don't know, I wasn't really paying attention. But I can tell Big City Greens is made with love, and its Pokemon parody was the first in this video to come from a non-cynical place. It's not as funny as the South Park episode, but I'll go ahead and give it a 9 out of 10, since it ticks all the boxes for a Pokemon parody. But it's not like a show has to be new to understand Pokemon. It's also hilarious that Zeno Robinson, the voice of Remy, is also the voice of Go in the anime. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy always had unique and crazy concepts for episodes. It's kind of the only one here that doesn't necessarily comment on Pokemon or Pokemonsters. I guess they're saying that Pokemon cards cause violence, and I mean, they kinda did for like a week in 1999. But this show is always violent. Of course, Mandy has to state that she thinks Pokemon is stupid, but she thinks everything is stupid. It kinda plays out like any Grim Adventures episode instead of really being a cutthroat Pokemon parody. Now, Grim doesn't understand the appeal of the cards, but I'll give him that one because he's the oldest character in I guess any cartoon. So he uses his powers to make Pokemonsters real and therefore even more exciting for Billy and Erwin, to the point where they ask for more because it'll make them as cool as rock stars or anchormen, and ultimately that chicks will dig them. I agree. Well, the Pokemonsters take over the town as they evolve and stronger Pokemonsters come to life. I like how this anchorman admits that Pokemonsters really are cute when they're little, and then they actually cleverly call back to when Billy said that real-life Pokemonsters would make them as cool as anchormen by having him state this:
"That's my favorite news guy."
Mandy ultimately saves the day by turning all the monsters into toast, and then she goes to sleep. 8 out of 10. But is there any Pokemon parody made during the height of Pokemania that gets pretty much all of its info correct, doesn't insult the players, and is entertaining in some way? Turns out in 1999, the Norm Show made a surprisingly comprehensive Pokemon parody. First, right off the bat, they pronounced Pokemon correctly.
That's right, kids, Pokémon.
back when the English dub itself was barely saying Pokémon, and certainly before the Sprouse twins were saying it. In the episode, this kid named Tommy delusionally thinks he's Ash. As soon as Ash does his signature hat rotation, we quickly find out Pokémon are real for some reason, and they're played by humans in costume. Immediately you'll notice that the effects are very good. But even more surprising, the kid instantly points out that he has a type advantage against Norm's Squirtle. Norm reprimands his Squirtle for hiding, exclaiming that Squirtle is a fighting Pokémon. That was literally the only mistake, honestly. Because right after, Norm chooses Butterfree, and it makes a similar enough cry to the anime, which makes it even clearer that they paid attention. Now they don't bring up the fact that Butterfree is also once again a bad matchup against Pikachu, but we do get to see fairly decent Team Rocket cosplay, and that's what matters. Norm and Ash even correctly pick moves that their Pokemon would use, which almost never happens in Pokemon parodies, outside of the electric moves that Pikachu has. And for the entire runtime of this sketch, I was waiting for Norm to say at least once that Pokemon makes no sense or that it's a fad, but at no point is Pokemon dismissed as a waste of time. It's not the funniest, Norm can do better. I mean, he used to. He's dead. But minus that, it's what I would want in a Pokemon parody. 9.1 out of 10. Now go check out my other Pokemon videos. There's so much variety. Leave a like if you want a part 2, and subscribe if you haven't. Check the description for all the music I used, the t-shirts I made for you guys, and my Patreon where you can get cool rewards like seeing my videos days early, which you could also do by clicking the join button. I'll see you guys very soon. Bye!